So we have a couple of things I can do for a bit of a little show and tell time before we get into individual questions. A very interesting and I think significant new development in the market is a book by Greg Hutton, Hutton's Guide to Martin Guitars, 1833 through 1969. This book is absolutely a groundbreaking, very important book. And while it's not cheap, it's a deluxe paperback for $80. It has years worth of research that has never been published elsewhere. Hutton spent not only years going through Martin's files of correspondence, literature, and Foreman's notes, things that are not readily publicly available, but that Martin gave him access to over a period of years. He photographed thousands of thousands, tens of thousands of pages of documents, letters, invoices, correspondence, you name it, he did it. And he managed to cross-index all of that in his computer files and assemble it in a way that had never been done before in the entire history of the Martin Company. So what he has published is information that is extremely valuable. And while it may seem that $80 may be a lot for a book like this, it has, well, and here 427 pages of information that condenses an enormous file of information about the history of Martin. Information that you can't find elsewhere. And if you compare it to the cost of just simply getting an appraisal on one guitar, this is a good deal. So we have an online appraisal service, $75 for a detailed written appraisal. Just go to our website, click on the appraisal button, send photos, information, whatever, and we give you a detailed appraisal that is not something simply computer generated, but is actually studying your photos, looking up what we need to, and providing a detailed appraisal. But the point is, what you have in this book, it won't be an appraisal, but the amount of knowledge in a book like this book is, in my opinion, an absolute must for anyone who is interested in the history of acoustic guitars, certainly for anybody interested in Martin guitars. And it's just an absolutely incredibly valuable source of research. It has black and white as well as color photos, and detailed information beyond anything I have ever seen in print. There are a number of good books about Martin, but none of them take the place of this book. So for your library and for your personal expansion of knowledge, I cannot stress more strongly how this book is absolutely one that anyone who is interested in guitar history, anyone who is a guitar collector, anyone who's investing in guitars, dealing in guitars, this book is absolutely a must to stay abreast of what is today's best available knowledge. And Hutton also, in his book, does refer to his website, such that it is possible to contact him for further detailed questions, because his research materials are in the thousands of pages, not just 427. So this book condenses his findings of 1833 through 1969. It does, however, also cover some of the Martin family's earlier history, going back into the 1820s. So Martin had worked for Johann Georg Stauffer in Vienna in the 1820s. And so there's a tremendous wealth of information. And again, I just cannot more strongly emphasize or recommend buying that book. It is absolutely critical for any collector, dealer, just anyone who's interested in history of acoustic guitars. That book is a must. Every week I like to feature, excuse me, an interesting instrument. So we have here, that will appear on our website tonight. This is a Larson Brothers Euphonon brand, and it is roughly the size of a Martin Triple O. It's 14 7/8 wide, whereas a Triple O Martin would be 15 wide, but it's 1/8 of an inch less. Similar in depth. Adirondack spruce, very fine quality quarter cut Brazilian rosewood back and sides, mahogany neck with center laminations on the back, 14 fret neck, abalone top trim. It's a beautiful guitar that is not yet on the website, but will be later in the day. And it is, in my opinion, a superb instrument. And things of that nature are sort of what keeps life interesting. We have a great selection of new instruments, used instruments, and collectible instruments. It's never possible to find an overabundance of collectibles. Pieces like this are fully as rare, if not more so, than Stradivari violins, but they're not currently today yet bringing Stradivarius prices. But they are still expensive, but really, really good. And I happen to be especially fond of Larson Brothers guitars. So if it goes to a good home, I will be well pleased. And if nobody likes it enough to buy it, I'll be well pleased to keep it myself. So either way, it'll go to a good home. We have a variety of questions that came in from listeners, and I will plow into them now. And again, feel free to send more if you send them to george@guitars.com or to the address on the website for this video session. Either way, I'll get them and I will plow into them. Jonathan K. says, I listened to my first one of your sessions recently and found it very interesting. There are lots of guitar builders who are seeking to reproduce the sound of the highly coveted pre-World War II Martins. Do you think anyone is getting close? I have played a number of dreadnoughts by makers seeking to do that, and they sound pretty different from each other. I have never played a pre-war Martin, so I can't really compare them to that. So just wondering if you think anyone is getting close to that pre-war sound. Well, there's a bunch of makers doing guitars with that in mind, and not just simply for dreadnought size. There are makers doing OM style, triple O style, dreadnought style, and even some of the smaller models, a wide variety. Obviously, one of the foremost makers doing that is the Martin Company itself. They have a variety of models in their catalog, especially their so-called authentic series that are made very close to the pre-World War II specifications. They feature Adirondack spruce instead of Brazilian rosewood. They are using Central American mahogany now. They were using Madagascar for a while. Brazilian rosewood is on Appendix 1 of the CITES Treaty, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species. Since June 11th of 1992, it has not been legal to bring in wood that cannot be certified as having been harvested before that date. So it's not very practical to get new Brazilian rosewood guitars. They tend to be extremely expensive for the wood, and it's not always easy to find high quality Brazilian that's left over. We have custom shop and special models from Martin that are made to our specs, Martin specials, that are designed by me in cooperation with Martin. And we feature some that are pretty close to pre-war specs, and others, such as my quadruple O size guitars, that are similar in shape to a triple O or OM, but bigger, and are not truly replicas of what they made in terms of they didn't make that exact model, but they're made to the specs that Martin would have used if somebody had ordered one in that size before. And I always felt that that was sort of a hole in Martin's line that they should fill. So Martin is making guitars like that, and we are selling them. But Santa Cruz, Collings, Hudson Dalton, Preston Thompson, to name a few, and another company that actually is named pre-war. They have trademarked the name pre-war, and they are building instruments that are vintage replicas, but have their name on them, but they are very closely modeled after Martin. Martin has trademarked their name, but they really don't have a trademark on much else. Their body shapes go back many years and were not trademarked originally, so they can be used by others. And what it gets down to is you can buy guitars from a variety of other builders. I forgot to mention Bourgeois. It's another one that does that sort of work. But there's plenty of them. But the Martin body shapes, pickguard shape, bridge shape, binding patterns, inlay patterns, purfling patterns are not trademarked. So there are makers who copy virtually all those details with varying degrees of success or skill. Makers that I named are all very good craftspeople doing fine work, and they have been achieving good results. I happen to be very pleased with the results from Martin on their standard line, which I think is better than it has been at any time in the past 50 years, as well as their authentic series and their so-called expert dealer series. There's only a few dealers handling those, but they are to the authentic specs with the exception of using Indian rosewood and having an adjustable T-bar in the neck, which is not true vintage spec, since the vintage originals had a steel non-adjustable T-bar during the period from late 1934 onward. But the ones prior to late 34 from Martin did not have a rod in the neck, but those also had bar frets, which provided compression fretting, and that could stiffen the neck. But with the advent of steel strings with gauges like medium and heavy, it got to the point where Martin decided it'd be better to have reinforcement. But Gibson had a patent on the adjustable truss rod, which they had introduced in 1921. So Martin could not do an adjustable rod like Gibson's pre-World War II. And then during the war, when that patent would have run out, they couldn't do adjustable rods because they couldn't do metal rods at all due to metal rationing during World War II. So it was only after the war that they reintroduced the T-bar and then replaced that around 68 with a square tube. And it was not till 1985 that Martin started using adjustable rods. But at any rate, the answer to your question, obviously, is that there are numerous other makers working on producing guitars with the so-called pre-war sound. I think that a lot of it with Martin has to do with the fact that they were using Adirondack spruce rather than Sitka spruce. They started using Sitka in '46, and Sitka does not produce what I consider to be the pre-war sound. And but there are indeed other makers today producing good guitars. And when they're made right, they do sound good virtually immediately. It may take a couple of weeks to break them in, but if they don't sound good when they're new, they're probably not going to become magically good when they're 20, 30, or 50 years old. You have to figure too, when Martin and other makers were producing guitars pre-World War II, the average life expectancy for people was not as long as it is today. They didn't have antibiotics. Penicillin didn't come out until after World War II, right after it. In fact, right about the time I was born. I didn't think it was going to be safe to come out until antibiotics were available. So I waited until August 21st to be born. And I didn't think it was going to be safe either to come out during a war. So I made sure that the war stopped a couple of weeks before I was born. And I really liked bluegrass, and that didn't start till I arrived either. So I think I'm very, very powerful. Even 5 years ago on my birthday, people were just looking up at the sky in awe. I had turned the sun off in a 40-mile wide band from coast to coast on my birthday. So I'm very special. But if you believe that, I can at least say those dates are correct. But I'm not as delusional as to believe that I personally caused it. Anyway, John B. Do I have any recommendations on earplugs to protect one's hearing from loud noises? There are numerous types of earplugs available, ranging from some that simply plug your ears and block out almost everything, to others that are designed to be custom fitted where they are comfortable, and also where they are filters that filter out beyond a certain volume and certain frequencies, rather than just blocking everything and making you slightly deaf. Any of the ones that are filter sound are what I would recommend. And so I don't have a specific brand to recommend, but the ones that are just simply some foam to stick in your ear, they're not particularly comfortable. They work to some extent. And if you're in an extremely loud room, the fact is, it is good to have some kind of protection. Acoustic guitars are not loud enough on their own to damage your hearing. But amplified guitars, acoustic or electric, with pickups and amplification, obviously can get extremely loud. And much of the music played today in performance halls and even in surprisingly small clubs is played at such high volume that you do indeed have the risk of losing hearing permanently, especially in the higher frequencies. And to me, I think that's a sign also that I hear in pickups, like Bill Lawrence and Leo Fender, both early in their careers made pickups that had nice, rich, thick, acoustically pleasant to listen to, but they had great bass, mid-range, and treble response. And later in their life, both of them made pickups that sound to me like breaking glass, and they don't have a tonality that I like. And what is in common for both of them is their hearing was shot. I watched Bill Lawrence play frequently enough. He'd sit right in front of the amp, turn up the volume high. He was a fine player, but he'd turn the volume high and be sitting right in front of the amp, just blasting himself with sound. Leo Fender had one glass eye, so he was blind. Well, he was missing an eye, and one of his eardrums had been blown out. He was working on an amplifier, and some idiot turned up the volume at full volume when Leo had his ear pressed right up on the amp, and it blew out his eardrum. And he really never did hear very well after that. With one ear was virtually deaf, and the other ear didn't hear very good frequency response either. He'd been exposed to such high volume noise for so long that it damaged his inner ears. But there's a lot of musicians who do not hear well. And since musicians need to hear as an integral part of their livelihood, it is important to protect themselves. But also, if you work in a club, concert venue, the servers, bartenders, a lot of the clubs in Nashville are in danger of losing their hearing permanently. It is on volumes that if it was a factory setting and OSHA came in to inspect, they'd shut it down or at least force sound control or proper ear protection. John B. goes on to discuss the subject of a guitar opening up. He says, a top luthier told me a good guitar is opened up from the beginning out of the gate and sounds good if it doesn't need to open up. On the other hand, some guitars appear to sound better the more they're played. There's a belief that older guitars sound better because they've been played a lot. Well, I'd already alluded to the fact that yes, guitars sound good right away if they're good guitars, but they do open up, and they are not absolutely fully there from the moment you first play the first note. But the really good ones do sound good immediately, yes. But if you play it hard for even a few hours, they do loosen up, and the difference can be quite dramatic. I've mentioned it in previous episodes that I've taken guitars backstage at the Opry and get into a bluegrass jam where the folks are playing a guitar that I've brought. And you can tell when it really opened up quite dramatically. You can tell what tune, what verse they were on when it all of a sudden was almost like Star Trek. You watch when they put it into warp drive and it goes whoosh. Well, yeah, they do that. And once they do that, that's pretty much awake. And that's a lasting thing. That's not just a one-time event. After that, they still can open up more. But guitars also go back to sleep a bit when you put them back in the case. So if it hasn't been played in a few days, as I've said many times before in numerous sessions, it needs to be awakened. And you can do that with about 3 to 5 minutes of really hard, high volume playing. It doesn't have to be anything artistically great. You can bang away first position chords as loud as you can do it, almost to the point of obnoxiously loud. But if you do that for 3 to 5 minutes, the guitar wakes up. And then you can play soft and pretty after that, and it sounds better and feels better. They do have to be awake. And that's something that is much akin to an athlete warming up before getting on the parallel bars or the rings. They do warm-up exercises to limber up, but they do things more gentle, and then they can do the vigorous performance. Well, with the guitar, waking it up is the reverse. You just bang hard as can be to get absolute max volume, driving it hard for about 3 minutes, maybe up as much as 5. And then you can play soft and pretty, and it's awake. But it still will need to do that almost every time you play it. It still sounds better if you wake it up for at least 3 minutes before you start playing your regular tunes. And the more they're played, it is true they get better, but also over time, wood chemistry changes and finishes also change. Finishes have solvents, and they will continue to outgas sometimes for a period of several years before that finish is truly completely cured or broken in. So things do change over time, but typically they don't change from where a guitar sounds mediocre to where it goes wonderful. The really good guitars sound good when they are brand new. And I know what the Martin sounded like 60 years ago because I'm old enough to remember that just fine. I'm 77 now. And I have no problem remembering how they used to sound. And I can also tell you that I believe that the amplifiers back then, the old Fender and Gibson amps, sounded better 50 and 60 years ago than they do now. But that's because amps are not made out of wood like guitars. Speaker cones are paper. And paper does not age as gracefully as wood. And the capacitors and various other components in an amp do not mellow and get better the way wood does. So frequently enough, to get the old style sound on an amp, if it's an old amp, it still may need some work. Things dry out. Paper and cardboard can change its chemistry, not for the better with age. And electronic components do not improve with age the way wood does. Another question, also from John B. The Blue Guitar Collection has been purchased by the Archtop Foundation, a new nonprofit organization formed earlier this year. They've been putting on several videos on YouTube recently and are planning on doing another blue guitar project. I think the guitars are in some kind of museum. Well, I know that one of the people involved with that is Rudy at Rudy's Music in New York. Scott this was a project that originally goes back to the 1980s when a collector assembled, just organized a bunch of folks, makers, inspired by Jimmy DeQuisto, to do a whole series of guitars with blue finish and somewhat wide necks, 18-inch wide bodies and 1 7/8 wide nut. And they were great guitars by a variety of makers, but it was everything from inspired by Jimmy DeQuisto. So that actually, Jimmy's blue guitar, the project would have been done in the 90s. Because Jimmy DeQuisto died in 95. So some of the finest ones in the collection were from Monteleone, but there were other makers, Benedetto, and Kim Walker, and actually numerous makers. There were a considerable group of guitars, but all done with those type specs. And they are interesting guitars for sure. But does it make them any better that they were blue? No, but it was Scott Chinnery's collection. And Chinnery had a collection of hundreds of instruments, including the teardrop-shaped D'Angelico guitar. Scott was a collector, but he had made his money in dietary supplements, which he insisted were not steroids, but they seemed to be things that converted in your body real quick to steroids. He died at about age 40 from a heart attack, which could well have been from his own products. But at any rate, he did have a collection that was millions of dollars. And he hired a publicity firm to help promote what he had been doing. And the blue guitar collection got a great deal of press, and they were fine instruments. But are they totally revolutionary? In my opinion, no. But what he did do is he certainly was one of the ones who absolutely promoted Jimmy DeQuisto, and that most assuredly did help DeQuisto's career. And he promoted guitars in general. So so far as the motivation of the folks doing this today, not being a mind reader, I can't give you any comment on that, but I will at least say that they are, as a group, extremely fine instruments, no question about it. And DeQuisto guitars and Monteleone guitars, when new, late in his lifetime, Jimmy was getting prices that were paid more by investors than by utility users. Monteleone today has prices that start over $50,000 and work up from there. But for $50,000, you don't even get binding or inlay. But his guitars are extremely good instruments. There's no question about it. But they are not used to any great extent by people on stage now. They are mostly from wealthy art patrons. So in his spring, summer, fall, winter four instrument collection on the seasons was bought by a patron who donated them to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But that does not in any way diminish from the fact that Monteleone guitars are extraordinarily fine instruments. And the guitars in the blue guitar collection vary greatly because they're not all by the same maker. Each one in the collection was from a different builder. But all of them are from builders who generally selected as being of interest. None were from amateurs. They are all very fine instruments. I have a question, three questions from Karsten. It says, in your 1990s book, A Photographic History on Acoustic Guitars, you exhibited a Gibson custom painted Venetian guitar. It looks like it has a Century of Progress style neck. Well, the neck was actually done a bit more like a Florentine banjo. It is a neck that had painted scenes on perloid, but it also had painted scenes, a scene of Venice, the canal scene on the back of the body. It was painted on the top, the back, and the sides. And that painting was done at Gibson. They also did some painted ukuleles that were rather fancy instruments. They were not in the catalog, but they were special order. That's a guitar that I had found at the Nashville flea market, along with some other instruments that a dealer was selling. And he knew they were valuable, but I still got them for what I would consider a bargain at that time. And it would sure enough be a screaming bargain today. But that particular book, unfortunately, is out of print. But it is a book that was co-authored by me with Walter Carter. And they can still be found online. So if you try Amazon, you can find acoustic guitars and other fretted instruments, and also a photo illustrated book on electric guitars and basses, also authored by me with Walter Carter. But the guitar that you're inquiring about was basically a 13.5-inch wide guitar, similar in dimensions to an early Nick Lucas model, but ultra deluxe ornamentation. And just as today, it's possible to order custom instruments from a variety of makers, well, you could do that back then. And so that has been a factor even as early as in the 1830s. Martin took custom orders. So, and Gibson, even from their earliest times, Orville Gibson was doing primarily custom things because it was a one-man shop. So it was not a large commercial venture. So whatever one ordered, if you ordered something special, Orville would make it. And later, the Gibson Company would make it. So that has always been something that could be done. And instruments that were presentation grade instruments have been around for a long time. I have seen and owned a number of presentation grade banjos, mandolins, and guitars. Martin was doing presentation grade, very special instruments, custom order, even in the 1830s onward. So that's part of a long tradition. I'm surprised he's asked what was my intention in creating a book, Photographic History, considering the market at the time. Well, spreading knowledge helps to enhance interest in the product. The more people know, the more they're likely to want them. They don't want what they don't know about. And the more knowledge you provide, the healthier a market will be. But uninformed people who don't know anything about the product are not so likely to want them. So my motivation was quite simple. I'm interested in spreading knowledge. I was not expecting it to be a get rich quick scheme. There's a lot easier ways to make money than spend years researching and writing to put out a product that goes to a relatively small audience and work with a publisher that gives a relatively small royalty. It's not like Stephen King doing a new horror novel. That pays. Or if Jonathan Kellerman does a detective mystery, that pays. A heck of a lot more people buy that. And in general, publishers give a big advance and there's a lot more money involved. But guitar books do not make people wealthy, but they sure enough do share information. And again, I can't hardly emphasize more strongly that if you're going to get a guitar book, if you're going to be collecting guitars, you need this one. Hutton's Guide to Martin Guitars, 1833 to 1969 by Greg Hutton. Center Stream Publishing, distributed by Hal Leonard. So my shop is not the only one that's got it, but we have them in stock. The book is $80, but it's worth a whole lot more than that, even from the first time you use it. If you use it and its knowledge that it imparts to you permits you to expand your collection or to be well informed when you're thinking about buying or selling or just simply expanding your knowledge, knowledge is power. And that book can help you. He also asks, how does replacing the Golden Era Fender neck truss rod affect its vintage value? Well, one, you don't normally have to replace one unless somebody's messed with it and screwed it up, but you can sure do that. If you tighten it too much, people don't know what to do and what not to do. And sometimes the do-it-yourself adjustments are the most expensive because you pay a lot to get them undone. But if the neck rod is damaged to the point of being unsalvageable, it's a major job to replace it, and it requires great skill. It is difficult to do without leaving some evidence of it. As a collectible, its value will be less than a pristine, perfect example. However, if you have it done by a true expert, the results should be very good and it will be playable. Whereas prior to doing the work, it would not be playable. And therefore, its value is enhanced by doing the work. It's sort of like if you have a car, it's really valuable, collectible, and you're in an accident and it has severe damage. Well, you can take it to an expert restoration place and they spend months of work on it and might run up a bill of $50,000 or more. And when they're done, it may look great. It may still drive quite well, but you know, it's not worth as much as one that had never been damaged, especially if the frame was bent. But it's worth a heck of a lot more than it was immediately after the accident. So you have value before the accident, value immediately after the accident. In an instant, it may be a few thousandths of a second. It goes from high value to incredibly devalued because of the accident. And then with months of restoration work, it is worth a heck of a lot more than immediately after the accident, but not worth as much as immediately before the accident. But good repairs enhance value. One last question from Karsten. What are the common Golden Era baritone guitars? Well, so far as acoustic baritone guitars, Golden Era, there ain't none. So far as electrics, I'm hard pressed to think of much other than the Dan Electro model 6 strings that were baritone. And you might consider the Fender Bass 6 And the early Gibson EB6 models, while they were touted as being six-string basses, you could string them as a baritone and they worked just fine. And Gibson made an EB6 that originally, the earliest EB6 was a hollow body guitar that looked very much like an ES335, but with a bass length 30-inch scale neck. And you could sure string that as a baritone guitar, electric. And then right after that, they did an EB6 that was like an SG, but it looked like a SG model guitar, except it had a 30-inch scale neck. And those can be strung either as a six-string bass or as a baritone guitar. And they work very, very well. But so far as baritone acoustics that are vintage, I'm not aware of any. But on electrics, basically Dan Electro, and then the Fender Bass 6 and the Gibson EB6, two variations of the EB6, I think could be considered baritone guitars. A question from John Battaglia. Why did Martin change their fret size? I tested my Martin guitars and could feel the difference and verified the change with Martin. I don't know exactly when they made the change, but it was done. But it was done within the past 5 years. Their standard frets were 37080, and they changed to 43080. The fret width stayed the same, but the height went from 37 thousandths of an inch to 43 thousandths of an inch, 5 thousandths higher. Fender uses the 43 or 43080 fret size as well. I verified this with Taylor. That's a difference that for most people isn't going to make much difference at all, but it does give them the ability to have more leeway in fret dressing. And if you have that extra fret height, does make it easier to dress frets, and also for people who do string bending, it tends to work better. And I personally like the higher fret wire. As much as I like vintage guitars, if I were designing a brand new guitar, I would not put a non-adjustable T-bar in the neck. I would put in a adjustable rod. I would be perfectly happy with slightly higher frets, and I certainly would have a compensated bridge saddle. And I would have a fret scale where the frets are very, very accurately cut, which can be done on a Plek machine, or at least it will be a computer-generated accurate fret scale. I'm not going to do it by eyeball, and I wouldn't necessarily just blindly copy vintage guitars for their fret scale. Gibson, through much of its history, used the Pythagorean formula for fret placement, and it has a small built-in error. And it is possible today with precision equipment to do a more accurate scale that most people can't hear the difference. However, it is nice to have the most accurate possible scale. Guitars do have a tempered scale, so that just like a piano, if you tune a piano absolutely perfect pitch, then you can find you can play in the key of C and in nothing else. So the same can be said for guitars. There is a tempered scale in the fret scale so that you can play in more than one key. But at any rate, that's as close as I can get to answering that. Another question from Battaglia: how important is quarter tone woods for the guitar top, back, and sides? Well, for the top, on spruce. It's very important. For the back and sides, rosewood does look good and sound good quarter sawn, but it also can do quite well flat sawn, and the same is true of maple. So it depends on the species of wood that you are using. But for backs and sides, hardwoods are not as critical that they be quarter cut. But for necks, a quarter cut neck is definitely stronger. And so in mahogany and necks in general, quarter cut is better. For tops, is no question, quarter cut is what you want on spruce. And he asks about the back, and on my birch 1924 Gibson L5, and the answer is no, it is not a strictly quarter sawn top. It's closer to being flat sawn. More questions. Greg Allwell says, regarding the baritone guitar question, are there any of the early 12-string guitars which were tuned to baritone tuning that might qualify? The early baritones, some from Holzapfel and from several Italian-American makers, and the early Stella guitars, such as Leadbelly's, were slightly longer scale and were intended for lower tuning, but typically by lower tuning, we're talking about maybe 3 frets below standard. And some of those had scales close to 26-inch to as much as 26.5. It depends on how one defines what is baritone tuning. But for example, Santa Cruz makes a guitar they're calling a baritone, but it's designed to be tuned 3 frets down. But then there are other makers doing electric baritones and even some acoustic baritones who were designed to be tuned 5 frets down. So there doesn't really seem to be a complete consensus on exactly what is baritone tuning. But 3 frets down does give a somewhat different sound, but I don't consider it to be really down to true baritone. But the early 12-string guitars, such as the Stellas, like Leadbelly played, would not do very well in standard tuning, and many players of 12 strings, even into the 1960s, were using relatively heavy strings and tuning 2 frets down quite often. So 1 step down and occasionally 3 frets down. But I think that in general, they were doing that on the 12 strings as much as anything, not to have a lower pitch, but to have guitars that would not fall apart. The tension on the 12 string is approximately twice as much as on a standard acoustic guitar. And that can be something that is difficult for most acoustic guitars to hold up to. Eugene Covington asks, in your opinion, does the majority of beautiful sound come from the spruce top or from the sides and bottom? A good top is critically important as a sound generator, but the sides are primarily a structural component to contain the air chamber and to separate the top and the back. The back is a sound reflector. But the sound that you get from maple versus rosewood versus mahogany versus walnut or some other woods can be considerably different. And on guitars, almost everything you change impacts the sound. Size of the air chamber is important. The wood is important. The size of the sound hole. A smaller sound hole gives you a lower pitch to the air chamber. Larger gives you a higher pitch to the air chamber. And then if you move the sound hole, some 12 fret guitars have the sound hole moved further from the neck joint than the standard 14 fret models. And the position of the sound hole with respect to the length of the body also affects sound. But in general, tops and backs both are important. But without a good sound, without a good top, the back can't do its job. So they're all important and they work together. Danny Nichols says, I recently went onto your site looking at your Martin inventory and saw some quadruple 028 Gruhn spec guitars. I thought they were a discontinued model offered by Martin and hope you still have one in your inventory in a few months. Can't purchase now, but will be heading your way in the spring. Well, the quadruple 028 is a model that Martin didn't make in the past. Originally, that size was used for their style F archtop guitars, 16 inches wide, made from 1935 through 1942. And then they discontinued making the archtops, but they had not made a flat top in that size pre-war. But in the 1970s, David Bromberg and a few others had archtop F-style Martins that had been converted to flat top with new tops. And David and his fans convinced Martin that they should do a guitar in that size. And Martin responded during the 70s with two models, which they called the M size, 16 inches. But I prefer to call them quadruple O's. And since Martin doesn't make M's now, except in a style M36, originally it was an M36 and an M38, which were strange specs. Since they didn't offer either 36 or 38 in any other size, it was not in keeping with standard Martin tradition. But at any rate, we have not discontinued ordering quadruple O size Martins. We have quite a few of them in stock now. We have every intention of continuing to order them. We like them. Darian Lewis King asks, do you believe pre-CBS Fender Jaguars and Jazzmasters will become as collectible and valuable as Stratocasters from this same era? My one-word answer is no. They are going up in value, and they did cost more money new than Tellys or Strats. But in my opinion, the switch system and their tremolo and bridge design left a goodly bit to be desired. And even their pickups didn't put out the power that you would get out of Tellys or Strats. But there are certainly people who seem to like them now, and the new ones, which Fender has remade with a better design bridge and tremolo, are doing quite well. But I have seen certainly that Jazzmasters and Jaguars have come from being not sought after much at all by collectors to now being seriously sought after, such that some of the custom color ones are bringing over $10,000. So that's certainly a major increase from where they had been. But it is not on par with the prices for similar age Telecasters or Stratocasters. And I do consider the Strat and the Telecaster design to be better than the original pre-CBS Jazzmasters and Jaguars. But the new Jazzmaster and Jaguar guitars offered by Fender have done away with some of the design flaws of the original pre-CBS Jazzmasters and Jaguars. So what they will be worth in the future, I can't say. When people ask me how much will my guitar be worth in 10 years, and occasionally they ask me in 20 years or 50 years, my standard answer has always in the past been, I don't have a crystal ball to answer that question, but these days we have the crystal ball right here. There it is. And if you hold something right up to the crystal ball, you can see the image magnified and right side up. But if you hold something, or if you look through the crystal ball at a distance, it's a lens and everything is upside down. And sometimes I think that's a good indication of what the world is really like. So I can't tell you what they're going to be worth in the future. But do I anticipate that in my lifetime, pre-CBS Strats and Tellys will be worth the same as the same age pre-CBS Jaguars and Jazzmasters? I don't think so. To the best of my ability to predict, I'm going to say it ain't going to happen. Peter Ward says, I just encountered and bought a 1960s Italian Echo with lots of buttons and all encased in yellow, white, mother of pearl, or at least it looks like that. What can you say about Echo and how can I clean it? Well, Echo is Italian made. And no, it is not mother of pearl. It is plastic mother of toilet seat, pearloid. And it can be cleaned with any polish that would be the same as you would use on cleaning plastic. You can clean it pretty well, and as long as it's not chemically decomposing, it'll clean just fine. But it is not mother of pearl. Renee Chavez says, I missed the title and author of the book. Would you be so kind as to post the name and author of it? Well, here it is. Mark Hutton's Guide to Martin Guitars, 1833 to 1969 by Greig, G-R-E-I-G, Hutton. Center Stream Publishing, distributed by Hal Leonard Publishing, and for sale here at Gruhn Guitars. And I'm sure will be available elsewhere as well. Mike Parks asks, what can you tell me about the Martin HD28V vintage? I have a 2015. Are they fairly true in the way they were made in the 40s? I know there's no Brazilian. The HD28V was braced pretty much the way they were in the mid 30s, not in the 40s. Those are forward shifted scallop bracing. And they have the 1 3/4 inch nut width also like the 30s. They are good instruments. And the HD28V is no longer being made. That's pretty much been folded into the regular HD28. So they no longer have an HD28 with lesser specs and an HD28 with fancier specs. They folded it into one, and the effect, the result is pretty much that you have one model now that is very much like the HD28V, but now called an HD28. And so that pretty much covers it. So right now, I think we have got it, and we'll wrap it up till next week. If you have any other questions, I'm easy enough to reach at my email address, george@guitars.com. If I didn't get them today in this video session and I have it on email, I will respond to those emails. And if they are warranting attention on next week's broadcast, I will do them as well, but I will give you a personalized email response. And on some, I will also feature them next week on air. But till then, have a good one. This is George Gruhn, Gruhn Guitars, Nashville, Tennessee, guitars.com, or me personally, george@guitars.com. You can visit in person or online. I'm here 6 days a week. I look forward to helping you.